so you've already chosen your greenhouse structure. So the next big thing is to decide what else you need. What do I actually need versus what's just extra? And this is where a lot of people can find themselves spending a whole lot more money. It can also get really overwhelming and confusing. A lot of people will tell me, I got the structure, Lori, you told me to cover my crop. That should help. And that's really true. You are going to be tremendously benefited from just covering your crop. And if that's all you can do right now, that is going to be an improvement. You're definitely protecting your plants from the wind and the pests and the disease that comes with rain and everything like that. So definite step one, getting the structure itself, right? The next thing you have to think about though is what additions are going to make my crop better and what things are going to make it, what things are the most important to invest in early on. And again, it's going to depend on what your goals are. Of course, that's always something to think about first, but you have to consider, are you growing anytime that the weather might change? And for most of us, the answer is yes. Anymore, the weather is so hard to predict. So the environment you're creating for your plants inside that greenhouse, you're looking for stability. That's what they want. That's what's going to make your plants thrive. So what items are going to provide stability and what things can be skipped for now or maybe not needed at all. But thinking ahead about this and thinking about what items are really going to be the most beneficial, starting early and thinking about that is key. We'll do a second part to this series on a video that's about what things are definitely you can hold off on. But this one, I want to focus more on what things you really should think about before even starting, if you can. And I can tell you from the experience of we didn't and couldn't. So I have the stories that aren't great and took a while with a learning curve that I'm trying to save you from, because hopefully you can just jump in a little bit better prepared than I think we were at some points. And that can help you be more successful faster. And that's the goal. So let's talk about what features are important and what things are just, they look impressive, but don't actually improve how well the plants grow. That's what we're going to focus on this video. So first and foremost, you got to remember, of course, your greenhouse is going to succeed. Your crop is going to succeed because it creates the stable growing environment that your plants are going to thrive with, right? It has the most stability, the most even growing environment, and not necessarily because it has the most technology. Airflow and temperature, light, moisture, those are elements that matter to your plants and not the gadgets. They don't care how you get there. They just want the environment. So things that you have to be non-negotiable on are thinking about your airflow and ventilation. It's important to think about how air is going to move through your high tunnel or your greenhouse. I think ventilation is so important along with considering just cooling in general, but airflow itself, just the movement of air simply, is incredibly important and can't be ignored. Poor airflow is going to cause overheating, humidity. The humidity will build up inside, and a whole host of other issues and diseases can happen from that. Now, when we consider airflow, there are so many ways you can do this. And I'll talk more in depth about each of the individual ways in it later. This one, I just want you to make sure you're considering all the elements that are things that need to be thought about in advance, because they can be costly, but they don't have to be. And if you think about them in advance, and when you're setting up your whole greenhouse, you think to yourself, how am I going to get air to flow before even setting things up? It may decide how you set things up. And I'll talk about that a little more with the heat. But with your cooling system, there's all different ways to do it. And it doesn't have to be super expensive. But a lot of times it's more costly if you don't think about it in advance. So putting steps in place early, definitely going to save you in the end. You can do roll-up sides, ridge vents, exhaust fans, of course, and then just circulation fans sometimes really help with airflow. I will throw in here too, we talked about the point is cooling as well as airflow kind of go together. Shade cloth is something we'll talk about later, another video as well, but those things can cool your greenhouse. And more than just cooling it though, is getting the air to move. You need that air to move through it, to dry things out so it doesn't get too steamy and too wet in there. so the diseases and things don't grow. And also it moves heat out. That's really important. Your climate, of course, that you live in and your size of kit are also going to make a little bit of a difference, of course, because how far you have to move the air is important to think about. So a little side note on how I learned this lesson the hard way, or I guess we did. When we first started and we got our buildings up, and I was thrilled just to have a building covering my plants, as most are, but I thought that was going to be at least getting us through the summer, because I wasn't thinking about tomatoes are sun-loving plants. They love the heat. They thrive. So my husband and I thought they'll do just fine in the summertime. But we had a crazy hot summer. And of course, I mean, obviously we know that inside a greenhouse is going to get even warmer, greenhouse effect and all, but didn't realize that temperatures were going to get so crazy hot that it could totally kill the crop in an afternoon. And we found ourselves in emergency mode and learning about doing whitewashes and learning about circulation fans, opening doors. If we had known to really look at that earlier on, I mean, we were looking at, and I think most people, when you're trying to get your crop going and get your business started and things, a lot of times you're looking at one step ahead. It's pretty much, I'll take this step and then I'll solve that when I get there. And we're kind of putting out the fires as they come. So it would have been nice to think about some of these things a little bit sooner with learning curve, and it may not apply to you, but if it does, I hope this helps you realize to think about that airflow is super important. No matter how you do it, airflow is key. Don't forget it. Another element that's a kind of a big one to think about, of course, if we have cooling and airflow, we got to talk about heat. Also incredibly important, but not necessary for everybody. I've had people who installed big heating systems and then tell me they really didn't need it. A lot of other people saying, of course, that they did need it and wish they'd installed it sooner or when they were building it, but it happens. Of course, better to have it, not need it. But if you're not looking to invest in something, think about the heat or how much you want to invest, because it depends, again, on what your goals are and where you live and how big your system is. You do need to consider the heat, though, because if you do decide that you want to grow into a little later season where it's getting colder, or your area is known for things like cold snaps earlier in the season, which I am hearing more and more about and experiencing here as well, that I plan my crop is set and it's going to be done by this point, so I don't have to worry about it, but wait, I got cold really fast or one random night. That happens all the time now. So think about how much heat you're going to need to do what you need and what your plants are going to need. So that's just something to just take into your thoughts of how I want to set this up. Because again, going into emergency mode, or I've heard the worst stories, unfortunately, of people losing their entire crop in a night. And that's heartbreaking. And we didn't do that. We came close, so we haven't done that. But it was definitely some scrambling sometimes too to get enough heat into the greenhouse whenever it was suddenly a colder night than had been expected. So putting thought into that in advance, that's another one it's non-negotiable. You can't just not think about it and expect to be successful. If you're doing season extension, often you can get away with very little supplemental heating. If you're growing year round, you're truly going to grow year round, that's when you really need to make sure you think about what you're doing with it, because there aren't very many environments that I have encountered that didn't require at least a little bit of supplemental heat at some point. Even in a really warm climate, it's amazing how often anymore there's a random cold spell. And with all the work you do, the last thing you want is your crop to die in one night because it dropped and you didn't have any heat in there. Another thing that you need to consider with your heat is it can be done in a variety of levels as well. Like I mentioned with the ventilation, you don't have to have giant heaters is the thing. Again, of course, it's going to depend on your climate. If you're in Wisconsin and you're growing year round, then yeah, I'm going to say you're probably going to need a pretty good size heater. But that being said, I've mentioned before, I have customers in Colorado who grow year round with no heat. And that is in Colorado. And they grow in the ground and they grow cold weather crops. So think about your crop. Might help you if you're trying to supplement and decide what to do with your heat. The crop you grow, that's going to depend on how much heat you need, right? So they grow cold weather crop. They cover their crop when it gets really cold, like with frost cloth, and they do not add heat. So it can be done in very different ways. You can also consider sectioning off parts of your greenhouse if you don't want to add as much heat. I was working with a school the other day, and their greenhouse, they didn't want to heat the whole thing because that was a big expense for the school. So we helped them just partition off a section of it. And that's what we used to do when we were doing our starts. We'd partition off a section. We could fit a lot of plants in that small space, and we could run heaters, smaller heaters in that small space, so that it didn't have to be quite so costly and without so much added to it. So again, and I know a lot of customers who do, they'll put their stuff they need heated in one space, heat that spot, and then they move it back out, when the cold snap's done or whatever. So it might be more work. So consider that as well, because your time's worth something. And I know as farmers, we often forget that part, but your time is worth something. So if you are moving plants in and out of a space over and over again, do you have time to realistically do that? Or is it worth investing in a different, more automated heat system versus I don't want to think about it. I want to turn the thermostat on and not think about that at all. So something to consider, but just make sure you do think about it and consider it in your setup, because it's important and it's not something you want to have to rush and do quickly and hope works. We'll talk more about different types of heating options, what they are good for, how much you need, that kind of thing in another video, along with ventilation more in depth. But again, to reiterate, I just want to go over that both the ventilation and the heating are things that deserve thought prior to maybe even starting your crop. And it may be something that you do add on, and that's fine, but just think about your timing. I do have customers a lot of times that I will advise to go ahead and get your building, get that up and going, and then get that heating system that you give it thought, decide how you want to do it, get that put in just before that gets to be too cold. Or you can still add those fans in, or your circulation or roll up sidewalls. Some systems, when you're building them, is the easiest time to add it. And that's something else to consider, because you don't want to be, who wants to have to redesign their end wall because they need to add their fans later? However, cost might be a deciding factor there, so it might be worth doing that. So just kind of consider all those options. It's really important to consider all of it. So if this video helped you to understand which greenhouse features really matter first for consideration, please give it a like and subscribe. In the next video, we'll talk some more about what you can actually hold off on and maybe add to your kit later on.